Recently, I went out of my way to write a brief retrospective on Ben Shapiro's career for the purpose of contextualizing his commentary on James Gunn's Superman 2025, and in the process, I remembered something I had forgotten. In 2023, Ben Shapiro's alternative media company, The Daily Wire, released another in an ongoing series of conservative cultural products called Lady Ballers. I did see some hardcore cope about this film online from people who seemed sort of satisfied with the fact that it was made at all, but generally, the temperature in the room that I took was that this was a waste of time. Why would anyone even bother watching it? Well, probably to make a YouTube review about it and talk about it, right? I could have done that back then when it was timely and would have gotten clicks, but I gave it a pass. The thing looked so interminable. I believe the review that stuck with me the most was the Chapo episode where Felix Biederman described it as thuddingly literal. So obviously I took a pass on writing a video about it, which would require not only watching it, but watching it back and considering it in some detail. But now, when nobody else is talking about it, seems like a great time. For the love of the game, let's talk Lady Ballers. Major spoilers lie ahead, lol, as I walk you through the way this film sets itself up and what it has to say. The opening scene isn't the worst, but it shows early signs of one of the film's chief pitfalls, which is that it never knows when a joke ends and when the truth begins. I suppose you could say that's part of the problem with polluting your political discourse with thinly veiled quote-unquote jokes that are really just things you actually believe said with a smirk. But it makes this movie borderline unwatchable, even if you're interested in what it has to say politically. There's no clear divide between the film's actual thesis about how men just need tough love, need to be told to nut up or shut up, need to stop being given participation trophies and told they're special snowflakes, and whatever else it is conservatives think liberals are doing wrong when raising and schooling children, and the exaggeration of the charisma and machismo of Jeremy Boring's coach character. This is evident from the beginning of the film, but Lady Ballers has no idea if the coach is attractive or not, if he's smart or not, or if his players really like him because they're getting something positive out of his leadership, or if alternatively they're just as dumb as he is. Frequently, the characters in the film will have dialogue that demonstrates their adoration for the coach, and it scans as hyperbolic for comedic effect. But the film seems to want to place political commentary in the same context as that exaggeration, which has the unintended, probably, effect of insinuating that either these characters are such losers that the irony of the situation includes the fact that they're unaware of what losers they are, which doesn't cast them in an admirable light, or rather that by proxy conservatives purvey a bunch of opinions that you would have to be a total Neanderthal to actually agree with. Again, this is a Daily Wire movie. It would be tempting to say that the people who wrote this film don't really understand conservatism. They might have the instincts that conservatives have, and to be sure, if you're only here to contextlessly laugh about the denigration of women and minorities, you'll be well served, in the former need at least, but there's no awareness of any principled conservative thought here. If your rhetoric is just a series of poorly stitched together cultural grievances, that isn't really a basis for an argument, and so politically the film has no thesis. I remember when this movie came out, and in the months that followed, I also recall a number of commentators reviewing the movie relatively poorly. I think the general consensus was that the film seems like it's just a poorly cobbled together hate screed with very little in the way of connecting threads, and that absence of follow-through in the film's core ideas does a lot in my mind to add to this general absence of any kind of thesis statement. Lady Ballers really wants to be Dodgeball. It styles itself as a comedy from that era, it deals in the same kind of heightened tropes, it's got a little bit of that same kind of lecherous masculine behavior, aggressively male energy is played for laughs, and it has plenty of pandering. But Jeremy Boring is no Vince Vaughn. In Dodgeball, a true underdog story released in 2004, the central conflict orbits the fact that Ben Stiller's character owns a big and successful gym franchise, and wants to buy up Vince Vaughn's local gym that is mostly a resource for people he knows and cares about in his immediate community. If you're a conservative, this film will play to your sensibilities just fine. You have absurd characters, sex gags, conservative cameos like Chuck Norris and William Shatner, venerated conservative tropes like the veteran tough love coach played by Rip Torn, but critically, you'll also be served politically. Dodgeball's thesis is about small business and community, about how business enterprises should serve the needs of the people they serve, and should be run by the right people for the right reasons. It's a movie that might be understood in some contexts as politically incorrect, but it's also friendly and parses a human dimension of a social issue in a more conservative way, by examining an economic problem not as an endemic fault of capitalism, but as a question of who is successful. Using sports to make that argument is ideal, since it's among our society's most legitimated forms of meritocratic competition, which veils ideology that usually serves the markets and their less meritocratic form of market competition in a more presentable fashion. If you examine jokes from Dodgeball and jokes from Ladyballers, you can actually see the discrepancy in real time. For example, compare Jeremy Boring's coaching to Rip Torn's. The character of Patches O'Houlihan is extreme, vulgar, crazy, and a little dangerous, but as much as the team sees him that way, they also need his help. There's friction in their team dynamic, such that when Vince Vaughn has that vision of Patches and his towel stain, he gets to be the comedic straight man, which is frequently his role in the film generally, and so the joke works by virtue of the contrast. If there's no comedic straight man, there's nothing for the audience to grab onto as a consistent rock, to feel like they're grounded when the absurdity of the comedy hits them. Ironically, Ladyballers is a film without a straight man in sight. Every character is just a heightened expression of what the writers seemingly want the audience to simultaneously believe is so funny that it's ridiculous, but so true that you, yes you, should be a conservative. How could you not be? It's not like that failure to divide those concepts would inherently make you feel like the successful people who run your movement are laughing at you with a film like this, thus perpetuating the same sense of cultural decline that you feel whenever you're reminded how out of step Hollywood's tendencies with your values really are. Could it be that the rich people running your movement are also a bunch of detestable weirdos who think you're a squealing hog who will pay them to denigrate you? I'll let that stand as a rhetorical question, but for a special hint, watch the scene in this film where they just straight up insert an ad read for a sponsor with barely any relevance to the ongoing scene, which already had product placement in it. I mentioned the appeal of conservative cultural cameos earlier. As with the Dodgeball example, I'm not inherently opposed to the idea, but like all Daily Wire properties, the consistent use of certain figures in acting roles presents Ladyballers not as a small-budget film which is straining the capacity of its cast and crew to sustain a large number of roles, but rather as a conservative make-work program for the core beneficiaries of its alternative media empire. Appropriately, even beyond Boring himself, every other scene needs to have a cameo from some Daily Wire figure. This is probably one of the things I hate the most about American conservatism, the degree to which so much of its media, whether in print or television or elsewhere, is predicated on just doing some things rich people told you to do, and elevating the same group of less than talented hacks over and over. Talented conservatives tend to come up in their own industries or cultural spaces, whereas conservative cultural spaces tend to be voids of talent because half the reason they exist seems to be to give the talentless something to do. The Daily Wire's catalog is generally egregious in this way, but ideally a film like Ladyballers is endurable because you're getting an anti-trans screed out of it at the very minimum. So how does this overproduced Crowder sketch land? Well, you'd be surprised perhaps if you're unfamiliar at how much of this movie really doesn't care about trans women. Trans men are almost utterly absent from the narrative, probably because this movie was brought to you by days ending in the letter Y. But you'd expect, hope even, that Ladyballers itself would care about, Lady Ballers. From almost beginning to end, this film expresses basically nothing but total contempt for female athletes as weak, inferior, and totally talentless. Throughout the film, we get a number of scenes with the coach and his daughter, but it's only at around the midway point of the film that we get a scene where the daughter is actually teaching the players, her dad, and the journalist who is working behind the scenes with the team to generate positive coverage for them, which makes me wonder if this is some kind of weird Gamergate reference. All about gender as per her public school indoctrination, which this film is crystal clear is a real thing, we promise. It's a scene that encapsulates so much of what this film is trying to do, as well as what it unfortunately is. The whiteboard that's used for the scene has thumbtacks stuck in it, for instance, such that red twine can connect various words representing different queer terminologies, but upon seeing this really pretty dull display, complete with Alex Jones' meme reference in the center of the board, there's a question in the viewer's mind of how the fuck anybody thought it made sense to have thumbtacks on a whiteboard. It's enough to make one wonder whether anybody who worked on this film ever attended a school themselves, but really it's just another way that a scene that could have comedic potential in another movie is lazily rolled through out of a desire to just say more things conservatives are supposed to agree with. But I went on to miss that, actually, because it's going into the second hour of the film that we get multiple montage sequences. There's a montage of a single basketball game, which for some reason is cut like it's happening over a long period of time, and the team is gaining a following for their exploits even though it's only one game. Then there's a better montage where the male athletes are, once again, beating up on all the female athletes, but at least it's visually a little more playful. It does contain one of the most psychotic things in this film, which is a shot where two of the guys walk into a women's shower in an over-the-shoulder shot, rip off their towels, and a bunch of women peek out from their individual showers with individual shower curtains at the boys, and you think the reverse shot is going to be them naked such that the back of the women's heads cover where their genitals should be, but it's actually that they're wearing another set of towels underneath their other towels, and that is played like it's raunchy when it's just insane. First of all, this is one of those things that conservative lies about trans women benefit from omitting, which is that a lot of women's facilities don't involve being naked in front of other women because they have their own stalls and everything. They didn't have to include that, but they did. Well, that's not the weirdest part of this sequence, though, and I know this sounds random, but it actually got to me when I was watching this film. Who the fuck walks into a bathroom and dramatically rips off their towel only to reveal another towel underneath? What are you, a psycho? You think you're Kakashi Hatake? In fact, they already did the mask under another mask joke earlier in the film with the liberal teacher. This is such an obvious joke and they fumbled it with their grubby little hate-nick butterfingers. After this, there's yet another montage, which includes some frankly rather sensual shots of female athletes getting the trans athletes' junk smashed in their faces while they do spit takes. Which, for some weird reason, I don't know, nothing in this movie follows any internal logic. I don't know why they had so much water in their mouths on the court. It's obviously not just spit, it's like a whole spray of water, and this is where the comedy in the film just becomes terminal. Everything up until this point was brain rot, but it was brain rot I could put up with. This entire sequence, or series of sequences, is just an extended humiliation of female athletes as a concept. A lot of the stuff they're struggling to do is portrayed as if it's either innately hard for them because they're women, as if no female athlete has ever been knocked over or hit with a basketball before, or it's portrayed as if they could do it, but it's cartoonishly easier for the men, which is a gag that itself is so silly that it undermines the premise of a bunch of the other jokes. I don't think I've ever watched a comedy before that had so many jokes juxtaposed with each other that would require me to believe so many competing and contradictory things in order to find them funny. It's bizarre. But there is a through line here, ideologically speaking. The one thing Lady Ballers knows for sure is that women are awful. They're pathetic followers who need powerful men to teach them the ways of the world, and those men have a God-given right to take whatever they want by virtue of the strong triumphing over the weak. That's barely subtext in this film. It's practically written into the dialogue. Lady Ballers says, "Women are losers. Be a winner. Be a man." And that's not even before what is probably the second most disgusting scene in the film. The coach's daughter comes to him and says she wants to be a boy so she can be a winner. Again, this film is not subtle. Jeremy Boring's character tries to reason with her by saying she doesn't have to be a boy to be a winner, but he folds with every counterexample she brings up, which involves conceding things that are completely untrue, like driving, parking, STEM, and rock and roll music. The sports examples are a little different. While it's true that there are differences in how hormones affect the body that do predispose people to be advantaged in sports in some ways, which notably most trans advocates don't even tend to deny, it's not true that any random group of men can necessarily compete against any professional woman in literally any sport. There's a certain level of cultural delusion that is still pretty commonplace in American society, but to clarify, if we're talking about these kinds of predispositions to athletic excellence, it's worth noting that it's not a question of attitude alone. Some people are more physically advantaged even within their own gender, and that's not something we get to choose. Having a body in that sense is really more of a thing that happens to us, a thing we're assigned, and we just have to decide how we deal with it. Lady Ballers expands that idea to women's social roles generally. It's a profoundly pessimistic view of women's role in society, using a bunk take on sex differences to argue that women are consigned to the fate of being the girlfriends, wives, and mothers of society, and that they simply have to get good at that. For this version of conservative ideology, men are just better. Better at certain things, true, but beyond that, Lady Ballers posits a world where men are God's chosen people. They are graced with power as masters of society, and the role of women is to be a necessary, subservient class whose perfection lies in gaining honor from acting well the part that has been made for them. The film doesn't need to invoke God to make its argument. In Lady Ballers, sexism has the inevitability of fate. For this particular conservative ideology, gender is a question of might making right, and the only moral complexity that could ever intervene against the right of men to take what they want from a society of subservient women is their need to act well their part, to be gracious winners of a game they never decided to play. And that gets me to the most disgusting scene in the film, the one that really takes the cake. And honestly, it's the one part of this film that feels genuinely hateful towards trans women. I'm a little surprised they waited until an hour and a half into the film, but at this point it was the most interesting thing happening, so let's talk about it. The coach decides that what real men would do is give up these opportunities so women can have them. Naturally, this sort of makes it seem like women's achievements are all basically gendered participation trophies to the writers of this film. But there's one player who isn't going along with it. See, there's basically 5 guys who comprise the team, and the one who has the most screen time is Alex, the one character who is actually transgender and not just pretending. She or he, and frankly I don't even want to begin to parse how to gender this character, there are no wrong answers here, it's a weird twist, says that she's actually a trans woman. Jeremy Boring's character, meanwhile, seems to believe that the reason people think they're transgender is that people's parents are too proud of them. This is a bizarre scene. It's hateful on a few levels. It's basically promoting conversion therapy for one thing, when the coach tells Alex he needs to seek help. But more than that, it's basically a callback to the coach's tough love scene with his daughter. You see, we're seemingly meant to have watched that scene and come away with the impression that the coach is a good father because he told his daughter something he thought was true, even though he basically just told her that women are destined to be second-class citizens. If we turn this dynamic around, it's interesting to note that you're not a particularly brave parent for telling your child the capital T truth about basically anything. You have power over your child, you have a position of authority over them. You're not standing up to them when you put them in their place, and it's a psychotic display of insecurity to try to invert that power dynamic to make it seem like a father telling his child she better get her ass back to the kitchen is somehow doing something righteous and bold. This is, of course, to say nothing of the fact that trans people actually do have rocky relationships with their parents. For a lot of them, their parent or parents are their first bully or bullies, and that dynamic is evident in how a lot of young girls are socialized in perhaps a less exaggerated but no less heavy-handed manner than the coach's conversation with his daughter. Trans people, and gay people as well, often have similar experiences. Queer youth face an absurd level of abandonment by their parents. I've personally known trans women who have gone through that. The idea that what's motivating this cultural shift is an excess of love is frankly a disturbed outlook. Jeremy Boring's character issues the corrective that Alex isn't a woman. When Alex fails to concede that this isn't the case, his coach strikes him in the genitals. Do you remember what I brought up earlier about the way that this film seems to treat men's right to take things from women as sort of both their natural entitlement but also as something they should graciously choose not to do? If that sounded contradictory, this scene resolves that contradiction. There isn't always much use in deconstructing comedy. Sometimes things are funny because they're relatable, and sometimes they're funny because they're absurd. The truth can be funny, but so can a lie. However, every once in a while, you get a joke that says something about someone or something, and I think this particular bit of slapstick says a lot about this film. Out of context, it's a throwaway joke, if somewhat encouraging of violence towards transgender women, which has an especially dark side in our culture. In context, it's a resolution of the contradiction. The use of this particular gag is a biological affirmation. The implication is that men have certain parts and women do not. But to invoke that supposed truth through pain is to invite questions of weakness into this caricature of masculinity. And so the figure of the man as a conservative archetype is thereby revealed to be at once both so strong that he can take what he wants by force, and is only stayed from doing so by his own virtue, but also so vulnerable that he can be defeated with literal below-the-belt attacks. He is mighty, yet the underhanded can still best him. This is basically revealing of what this film actually thinks of women. The whole middle third of the film is a humiliation of the female sex, but the gag is a nod to the actual ideological structure sustaining that point of view. In reality, as previously stated, there are plenty of things this film describes men being better at, which not only could a man lose to a woman, but in some cases it might not even be unusual for him to lose to a woman. Since this film's thesis about gender as biological fate would be undermined if those categories were too loose, or if women could escape that dynamic, men's supremacy must be enforced ideologically if it cannot be unilaterally, naturally asserted. In that case, this ideology needs an explanation for why a man could lose to a woman for those times when men can and will lose to women. In other words, this conservative way of thinking needs an out, a way to cope with the fact that almost none of this bullshit is true. So, what's a conservative thinker to do? Well, alongside your assertions of the power and virtue of maleness, be sure to mention that men can be defeated by trickery and underhanded attacks. Women in this view are a sort of anti-Semitic caricature for modern American conservatism, which does not paint this movement's view of trans women in a forgiving light. Now finally, I feel like I've said what needed to be said about this movie. I obviously didn't originally want to make a video like this, but frankly sometimes something is so stupid and unfunny that it comes back around to being funny. And to be clear, I'm talking about the act of taking this movie seriously, not the movie itself. It's still not a very funny movie. There's a ghost of a funny script there. I could have seen a more competent, self-aware, and emotionally easygoing film with slightly fewer cameos, which in this context are basically just castings half the time, and a little bit more heart, substituted in for some of the cultural grievances maybe appearing in the theater near you a couple of decades ago. If I had to say one nice thing about this film, it would be that it's an eminently survivable experience, technically non-lethal, and I did not feel the need to commit seppuku to restore my honor while watching it, probably because I didn't write it. Until next time, let me know what you all thought, and I will catch you again soon for something less stupid. Take care, folks. Also, did anybody else think it was a missed opportunity that the cowboy guy didn't say his line when the brothers mentioned they still sell bail bonds? How much? You know? I don't know, man. This movie's a piece of shit.